The harbor never slept. Before sunrise, merchant ships were already cutting through the morning mist, their sails carrying spices from distant deserts, silk from eastern kingdoms, rare timber from forgotten islands, and gold that crossed more borders than most men ever would. The docks echo with the sound of cranes lifting cargo, sailors shouting orders, merchants negotiating fortunes, and waves striking ancient stone walls that had witnessed centuries of ambition. Every sunrise brought another opportunity to become richer. Every sunset ended with someone becoming poorer. The city existed for one purpose: trade. At the very center of it all stood the largest warehouse ever built on those shores. Its walls stretched farther than the eye could comfortably follow. Its doors were reinforced with iron. Its vaults were guarded day and night by armed men whose loyalty had been purchased with fortunes of their own. Everything inside belonged to one man, the merchant. Few people remembered his real name anymore. Titles have a strange way of replacing identity. To sailors, he was the master of the sea routes. To kings, he was a man who could finance wars. To rivals, he was the impossible competitor who somehow always arrived first. To the poor, he was a legend. To himself, he was still not rich enough. Every morning followed the same ritual. Before speaking to another human being, he reviewed numbers, profits, ships, contracts, markets, losses, forecasts. The pages changed. The totals grew larger, yet the feeling never changed. There was always another opportunity, waiting somewhere beyond the horizon. Another investment, another fleet, another city that could be controlled, another fortune still left to build. His advisors admired his discipline. His competitors feared his ambition. His workers respected his precision. No one questioned his success. After all, success surrounded him everywhere. The finest clothes, the finest wine, the largest home overlooking the harbor, paintings collected from distant kingdoms, jewels that once belonged to emperors. Even his dining table had been carved from a single piece of wood brought across an entire ocean because ordinary craftsmanship no longer impressed him. Everything money could buy already belonged to him. Yet every achievement lasted only a few days before becoming ordinary. When he purchased his 10th ship, he immediately wanted 20. When 20 arrived, he dreamed of 50. When 50 crossed a harbor carrying his flag, he began calculating what 100 might accomplish. His victories never ended. Neither did his hunger. His assistants noticed something strange. The richer the merchant became, the less often he smiled. At first they assumed he was simply tired. Then they blamed responsibility. Later they convinced themselves that powerful people simply lived differently. None of them considered another possibility. Perhaps he had become a servant to the very thing he believed he controlled. One evening, the harbor celebrated the arrival of the greatest trading fleet ever assembled. 30 magnificent ships entered the bay together. Their sails filled the horizon. Crowds gathered along the docks. Musicians played. Children cheered. Fireworks illuminated the evening sky. The city celebrated its greatest merchant. The merchant stood upon the balcony overlooking the harbor. Below him, thousands celebrated his success. His advisors expected pride. His workers expected gratitude. Instead, he quietly asked his accountant, "How many more ships does our closest competitor own?" The accountant looked surprised. 7. The merchant remained silent for a moment, then replied, "Build 20 more." The celebration continued beneath him, but he was no longer watching the ships. His mind had already sailed toward the next victory. Later that night, after the music faded and the harbor finally became quiet, the merchant walked alone through his private vaults. Rows of gold stretched into darkness. Silver coins overflowed from enormous chests. Rare gemstones sparkled beneath torchlight. The wealth of kingdoms surrounded him. He reached out and picked up a single gold coin. He turned it slowly between his fingers. Years ago, holding one coin had filled him with excitement. Now, holding 1,000 felt exactly the same. Nothing. He placed the coin back into the chest. The silence inside the vault seemed strangely loud. For a brief moment, a thought appeared that he immediately tried to dismiss. How much is enough? He closed the vault, locked the doors, walked away. But the question quietly followed him. The following morning, Another ship arrived. Then another. Contracts awaited his signature. Captains requested new investments. Messengers carried invitations from kings seeking loans for future wars. Everything he had once dreamed of now demanded his attention every hour of every day. He had become the wealthiest man anyone had ever known. Yet his schedule had never felt more crowded. His mind had never felt more restless. And his nights had never felt so empty. A week later, an unfamiliar traveler stepped onto the harbor. He carried no merchandise, no guards, no expensive clothing, only a weathered cloak, a leather satchel filled with books, and the calm expression of a man who seemed completely uninterested in everything the harbor valued. The merchants ignored him. The sailors laughed at him. The dock workers assumed he was another wandering scholar searching for food. Only one thing caught the merchant's attention. The traveler looked at the endless warehouses. Without envy, he looked at the magnificent ships. Without admiration, he looked at mountains of gold being unloaded. Without curiosity, it was the first face the merchant had seen in years that could not be impressed. Curiosity overcame habit. He ordered his guards to bring the traveler to his office. Minutes later, the old man entered. He did not bow. He did not compliment the wealth surrounding him. Instead, he walked toward the enormous window overlooking the harbor and watched another fleet arrive beneath the setting sun. The merchant smiled confidently. "Beautiful, isn't it?" The traveler nodded once. "It is." The merchant spread his arms toward the harbor. "Everything you see belongs to me." The old man remained silent. Then, without turning around, he asked a single question. "Tell me, if everything belongs to you, why you still look like a man searching for something?" The room fell completely silent. For the first time in years, the wealthiest man in the world found himself unable to answer. The traveler slowly turned. His name was Friedrich Nietzsche. The office remained silent. Beyond the enormous windows, the harbor continued exactly as it always had. Ships arrived. Ships departed. Merchants negotiated fortunes. Workers carried crates filled with silk, spices, gold, and precious stones across the docks. Nothing had changed. And yet, somehow, everything felt different, because one simple question had entered the room. If everything belongs to you, why you still look like a man searching for something? The merchant turned away from the window. For the first time in many years, he found himself studying another man instead of another opportunity. Across the room stood Friedrich Nietzsche, calm, patient, completely unmoved by the wealth surrounding him. The merchant finally spoke. "You think money cannot buy happiness." Nietzsche shook his head. "I never said that." The merchant looked surprised. "It can buy comfort. It can buy safety. It can buy freedom from many hardships." He paused. "But comfort and peace are not the same thing." The words settled quietly into the room, because they were impossible to dismiss. The merchant had bought comfort long ago, yet peace had never arrived with it. Still, he defended himself. "I built all of this. I worked while others slept. I risked everything. I earned every coin." Nietzsche nodded. "I believe you, and that is not your problem." The merchant frowned. "Then what is?" Instead of answering, Nietzsche asked another question. "When was the last time you watched one of your ships leave the harbor, without calculating what it would bring back?" The merchant opened his mouth, then stopped. He could remember every profit, every trade route, every successful investment. But he could not remember the last time he had simply watched the sea, without thinking about ownership, without thinking about numbers, without thinking about what could be gained. Nietzsche slowly walked toward the enormous map hanging on the wall. Every sea route was marked, every port, every warehouse, every investment. It was less a map of the world than a map of the merchant's desires. The philosopher traced one route with his finger. You own ships in every direction, yet your mind never arrives anywhere. The merchant remained silent because something inside him had begun to shift. Not satisfaction, not agreement, recognition. And recognition is often the first crack in an illusion. Over the following days, Nietzsche accepted the merchant's invitation to remain in the harbor, not to teach, not to advise, only to observe. He watched the merchant from sunrise until long after sunset. He noticed how every conversation became a negotiation. Every meal became a meeting. Every friendship became an opportunity. Every success became the starting point for another ambition. The merchant never rested. Even while celebrating one achievement, he was already chasing the next. One afternoon, they stood together overlooking the docks. Another fleet had just returned safely. The captain proudly announced record profits. The workers cheered. The advisors applauded. The merchant listened carefully, then asked only one question. How soon can they sail again? The captain hesitated. My lord, the men have been at sea for 5 months. They need time. The merchant answered immediately. So does the market. The celebration ended. The sailors quietly returned to work. Nietzsche watched the entire exchange without speaking. Only later, as the sun disappeared beyond the sea, did he finally ask, when will it be enough? The merchant answered confidently, when I have more than anyone else. Nietzsche smiled faintly, and if tomorrow someone becomes richer? The merchant replied without hesitation, then I must become richer again. The philosopher nodded slowly. As I expected, the merchant folded his arms. You say that as though something is wrong. Nietzsche looked toward the endless horizon. You no longer own your desires. They own you. The evening wind carried silence across the harbor. Ships rocked gently against the docks. Far away, gulls circled above the sea. The merchant stared at the horizon. For years he had believed desire was the engine of greatness. Without it, there would be no empire, no wealth, no success. But now another possibility appeared before him. Perhaps desire had once been his servant, and somewhere along the journey, it had quietly become his master. Nietzsche continued, the world believes a poor man lacks money. He looked directly at the merchant, but the man who can never say enough will always remain poor. The word struck harder than any financial loss, because for the first time, the merchant realized he had measured wealth by what he possessed, never by what he no longer needed. The harbor remained as busy as ever. The ships continued arriving. The markets continued growing. Nothing outside had changed, but inside, the richest man in the world had begun to wonder whether he had spent his entire life accumulating everything, except the one thing he could never purchase. The harbor awakened beneath the sky, painted with shades of gold and deep blue. Ships slowly drifted toward the open sea. Dock workers began another day of loading cargo. Merchants argued over prices. Sailors prepared for distant voyages. The city moved exactly as it always had. Nothing had changed. And yet, somehow, everything had, because something had shifted, not within the harbor, not within the markets, not within the vaults overflowing with gold, but within the man who had spent his entire life believing that one more fortune would finally be enough. For the first time in decades, the merchant did not begin his morning by opening his account books. He walked instead toward the end of the harbor, alone, without advisors, without guards, without accountants following behind him. He stood at the edge of the old stone pier. The sea stretched endlessly before him. Dozens of his own ships sailed toward the horizon. Usually he would have calculated their value, estimated their profits, imagined the wealth they would soon return with. Today, he simply watched them disappear. The wind carried the smell of salt across the water. The waves moved without ambition. The horizon asked for nothing. And for the first time in many years, neither did he. Behind him, Friedrich Nietzsche approached quietly. Neither man spoke for several moments. The silence itself seemed meaningful. Finally, the merchant broke it. I thought wealth would give me freedom. Nietzsche looked toward the sea. And did it? The merchant smiled faintly. It gave me choices. He paused. But every new choice created another desire. Another ship, another warehouse, another trade route, another victory. He lowered his head. I spent my entire life chasing more, without ever asking why. The philosopher nodded. That is how desire becomes a prison. The words settled softly into the morning air. The merchant looked toward the endless line of ships carrying his flag, not with pride, not with greed, but with distance. For the first time, they looked like tools, not proof of his worth, not proof of his success. Simply ships, nothing more. A young dockworker approached, carrying a ledger. "My lord, the Eastern merchants are waiting. The contracts are ready. The prices are favorable." Only days earlier, the merchant would have hurried back without hesitation. Instead, he closed the ledger, gently, and handed it back. "They can wait until tomorrow." The young worker stared at him in disbelief. "But my lord, the market may change." The merchant smiled. "So may I." The dock worker quietly stepped away. Nietzsche watched the exchange without saying a word, because this was not the victory. It was only the evidence. The real victory had happened moments earlier. The merchant had chosen peace over urgency, enough over more, presence over possession. The sea continued its endless rhythm. The city behind them remained consumed by trade. Nothing around them understood what had just happened. History would remember the merchant for his fortune, his fleets, his empire of commerce. It would never record the morning he stopped measuring life by accumulation. Yet Nietzsche knew that was the only victory truly worth remembering. The philosopher adjusted his weathered cloak, then turned toward the road, leading away from the harbor. The merchant called after him one final time. "There's one question I still cannot answer." Nietzsche stopped, without turning around. The merchant asked quietly, "How do I know when I finally have enough?" A gentle breeze crossed the harbor. The philosopher looked toward the sea, where one ship had already become a tiny silhouette against the horizon. Then he answered, "The moment your happiness no longer depends on getting more. You already do." Silence followed, not an empty silence, a peaceful one. The merchant stood alone on the pier as the philosopher disappeared into the morning light. The harbor continued buying, selling, competing, growing, exactly as before. But the richest man in the city no longer measured his life by the size of his warehouses or the weight of his gold. He measured it by something no market could trade: contentment. And as another fleet vanished beyond the horizon, he finally understood what all his wealth had failed to teach him. The poorest person is not the one who owns the least. It is the one who can never stop needing more. And perhaps the richest person is not the one who possesses everything, but the one who has finally learned the quiet power of saying, "Enough,"